Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today I've got Jay Anglin, friend of the show and the Waterfowl 360 Great Lakes Region Migration Editor, joining me. Jay, welcome back.
It's always good to be here, buddy.
You know, I wanted to reach out to you. We've got some Great Lakes states opening. Some of them already have, like Minnesota. But I wanted to reach out to you and just kind of get a feel for what's going on. I know that weather's changing a little bit, and just want to provide our listeners a little bit of update of what's going on up there in your neck of the woods.
Well, you know, we had several states open. Of course, Minnesota, the whole state pretty much opened last week. And then Wisconsin, the North Zone, Michigan, the North Zone. And then as these weekends progress, each state Wisconsin and Michigan, of course, eventually Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, we just keep opening every weekend. Another, zone opens. I'll tell you what, the teal migration this year was spectacular. And a lot of guys really, took advantage of that. One thing I did notice, there was a big stall once the birds got past that big wave of teal, initial wave of blue wings especially, things sort of really died down. Didn't see a ton of birds around wild goose hunting, but this weather system right now it's so legit. I mean, this is going to drive a ton of birds out of the prairies into these Great Lakes states.
And a majority of these birds are, they're going to be those early migrators anyway. And I know we were kind of talking offline, and you mentioned that, while you were goose hunting in northern Indiana last week, or even the week before, you'd even seen some pintails come through.
Yeah, so I went out with the idea of teal hunting one morning for a quickie hunt, as I like to call them, and ended up shooting a limit of 5 geese. I called in, singles and pairs, and enjoyed that, shooting those with 1 ounce sixes. And, that's always exciting. But I did see a pair of pintail, a drake and a hen, work in. I saw a fair number, of course, plenty of wood ducks, local mallards. And I started seeing some relatively large flocks of mallards as well. So we had a few early migrants come down, even big ducks. But, the big numbers of our, early birds, quote unquote, are should be starting. We should really start seeing them here in these middle zones, now, today, tomorrow, this weekend.
Now, while you're in northern Indiana, you do kind of bounce around up there in the region. Are you hearing anything from any of the other states? I know you've got some buddies that hunt up in the UP of Michigan. And are you hearing anything from those guys?
Well, my son's up there as well. And so he's always a good source of information. Have his dad rattling his cage every other day. But, the Sioux, our old friend, Dylan Graves, said that the Eastern UP was really slow for the opener last weekend. I guess there was a ton of pressure, and, but a lot of guys weren't seeing birds. So, you might chalk it up to, there was so much pressure, they just weren't working. But I think in this case, it was kind of in that sort of dead zone, where there wasn't a lot of new birds, and a lot of the birds that did come through had already left and continued on down the flyway. And my son parroted the same thing over in the central UP. Wisconsin, I've heard mixed opinions. Some guys did really well, in particular on local birds. But, one thing we've had this year that's been, sort of fortuitous for some people and problematic for others is the Great Lakes are very high right now. Even in some cases, you're hearing record levels. So there's a lot of water associated with the Great Lakes in the immediate watersheds, rivers, marshes. Whereas inland, in a lot of places, it's been incredibly dry. Certainly around here, that has been a huge problem. We just got really, really dry. So while we did have locally a lot of production here in a lot of areas in adjacent Michigan and Illinois, those birds moved to permanent water, and a lot of the little marshes dried up. And some of them, this could be a good thing, though. Like, for example, I was talking to, a guy in western Minnesota, and he said, we're really dry around here. And a lot of birds weren't stopping, they're moving right through. But that said, some were moving into the permanent water area. So you just have to make your adjustments, scout. I mean, there are areas, like around here, I can go 20 minutes south and there are some wet areas. So just like any other year, you need to do your scouting, and you find water. You're going to find birds this year, because I think a lot of areas are really going to be encumbered by dry conditions until we get more rain. And there's certainly some in the forecast. So hopefully that helps.
And let's go back to this weather front kicking up right now. You kind of mentioned this is really ideal time. And it's going to really kind of set the stage for the early parts of the migration into the Great Lakes area. What exactly is changing, and how are you seeing this weather kind of start pushing these birds in?
Well, when I lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, these are the systems that really kind of, paid the bills, so to speak, when it came to waterfowl hunting, because you're far enough north that you start to get a pretty heavy migration. And one of the things about the northern tier of the Great Lakes is, people always say, oh, it's Mississippi flyway. Of course it is. But a lot of the Atlantic flyway birds that cut across from the prairies in southern Canada and the boreal areas of Canada, they cut right through the Great Lakes. And so even though we see, obviously the birds that funnel down into the Mississippi flyway, systems like this, you're going to get that, but you're also going to get a boost from some of the Atlantic flyway birds that have, a considerable distance to fly to get over into, the eastern part of Canada and of course the U.S. But these are the situations where you see the big push of remaining teal, widgeon, some pintail, and it's not going to be like a big duck migration where you see a lot of mallards and blacks and probably pintails. But the bottom line is these we're going to see a lot of birds move down and filter down into these areas, and with seasons opening in the mid tier of these Great Lakes states, to the north, pressure is going to drive these birds down the flyway a little further. And I think everybody's going to probably benefit from this system alone. We're probably going to have really good openers, I would have to guess, throughout these states. So that's really good news for a lot of guys.
Yeah. And when exactly does the North Zone in Indiana open?
The North Zone is the third weekend of October.
Okay.
So we have ways to go, because some of these states open a little earlier. Adjacent southern Michigan opens the week prior. And again, it's just like this, this domino effect where you have birds, they kind of settle in, and then an opener comes along, they get bounced down, and they just keep moving down. And then, of course, by the time we open, we start seeing more and more migration kick in.
So what's the habitat look like around you right now? I know you mentioned it was a little dry. Where I'm from in more central Indiana, it is really dry there and has been for quite some time. And they got a lot of rain early, pretty timely for the corn and beans out there, but then it just completely dried up. Is that kind of the same thing that you guys are facing in the northern part of the state?
Yeah. So, crops are coming out super early this year. And, we did pick up an amazing, a lot of the local goose population this year, probably the most I've ever seen in the spring. And then the molt migrants left, and then they came back a little later this year. And that worked out really well because they came in big bunches. And so because of so many crops coming out, we are holding a ton of geese right now in a lot of these areas, corn, beans, of course, hay's long gone, but in some cases, they might get another cutting out of it. But bottom line is the most of the wetlands are dry, or at least mostly dry. But in some cases, they dried up early enough that there's been a lot of moist soil growth. So what's interesting is if we do get wet, there's going to be a ton of food for these birds because you had a lot of wild millet kick in, of course, a lot of smartweed, real, preferred food for a considerable number of species of birds, of waterfowl. And I feel that if we get some rain that's substantial enough to fill some of these wetlands, it's really going to help. Fortunately, there's enough managed areas that are, flooded via dike and levee and pump. And of course, that's all going to attract a ton of birds this year.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned that you got out on a few teal hunts and there were large numbers of teal pushing through very early this year, just due to some little bit chillier temperatures that first week of September. I know people all across the country were reporting, especially down in the South, Texas, Louisiana, they had some pretty decent teal shoots. You had a buddy there in Indiana who drew at Goose Pond, and him and his dad went out there and they shot 10 on, I think it was the opening weekend. Had a pretty good shoot. I mean, I would say that's fantastic for central Indiana teal hunting. But what else did you hear throughout the state and throughout the region as far as blue wings go?
Well, opening day here, it's a little later than it has been in decades past, because Indiana's always been, we've had as long as I can remember, an early teal season, whereas some states haven't. It was a little later this year, and so that really big push of blue wings that came through, honestly, by the time we opened here, it was just about past us. And unfortunately, now that said, opening weekend, I chose to goose hunt, and we did really well. Both days, Saturday and Sunday. A couple good buddies of mine did really well. But from when I spoke to some guys at Teal hunted, they said it was pretty good. Especially the first 2 days. I got out twice, I believe, and never saw a single teal. Actually, I take that back. I did see one single bluewing one day, bringing up the rear, But so I think we kind of got gypped a little here because it's a little later. But really, when you go over to like the Illinois River Valley and the Mississippi, they were holding tens of thousands of bluewings for several weeks. And that's no big surprise because that's such a phenomenal, area, just absolutely, full of waterfowl habitat for mile after mile after mile, both rivers. And they hold a ton of birds. And that's certainly going to feed, the birds are slowly but surely moving down the flyway. I know in Michigan, guys that are not used to this early teal season, the guys that did get out really did well.
Mm-hmm.
And the same can be said for Wisconsin. I heard some great reports out of Wisconsin as well.
I think with that situation, those states up there, I mean, that's fairly new as far as having an early teal season. I'm not sure it's 7-8 years, something like that. They haven't had it for too long. Don't quote me on that exactly. But the guys who were out there and were prepared for it and, kind of spent their time scouting, they were all very successful. So, I guess that's the reality in some of those mid-latitude states where you just have to be ready for them. And I'm sure you're so used to that, being in Indiana that, that's just part of the game.
Well, it is. And I kept reminding some of my friends, they're frustrated. I'm not seeing any, I'm not seeing any. I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go, whatever. I'm going to go to the beach. People forget, teal migrate earlier and they push all the way to the Gulf Coast, often in early September. And so regardless of the weather, they're pretty much calendar ducks. I mean, they're going to push. You get one little north wind one night, a little chillier, boom, they're moving. And a lot of the people in those states haven't quite adapted to that yet. In my case, I hunt primarily migration, and you roll the dice one day and say, okay, I'm going to go tomorrow. It's 56 degrees tonight, light northwest wind, clear skies. I'm out there, and then it just doesn't happen. It didn't come to fruition, and that's the nature of this thing, as you know. But talking to like Brett Amundsen in Minnesota, they don't have an early teal season because it's production state.
Yeah.
So he's the host of Prairie Sportsman, and I was talking to him, and they were seeing a ton of birds in western Minnesota at the same time. So that whole wave of blue wings just came right down through the flyway. And again, I missed it.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're still trickling through. I've talked to some of our other guys, and, South Dakota kicked off last weekend, and John Pullman, our other Central Flyway migration editor out there, he was reporting quite strong numbers of blue-winged teal still in South Dakota. So, yeah, I mean, the teal are spread out from Canada to Louisiana, Texas right now, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see plenty of them here. I can think of one time when I had one come in the last day of the season here. So we even get some really late blue wings through here, on top of, zillions of green wings, it seems like.
Well, that's great, man. I appreciate you providing this little bit of update. Any tidbit of information, especially in the Great Lakes area, is beneficial to hunters out there. And most of them are either preparing for an upcoming opener or already have one pass through and just preparing for the second weekend. So I do appreciate you coming on and providing this information.
Oh, I love coming on anytime, man.
All right. Hopefully we'll get you on here very soon. You can provide an update maybe next week or the week after.
I'm in.
Awesome. Hey, I'd like to thank my guest, Jay Anglin, the Waterfowl 360 Great Lakes Region Migration Editor, for joining us today and providing this information. I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for doing a fantastic job of getting the podcast put together. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the Ducks Unlimited podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.